Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest of our webinars. And we are today joined by Leo Johnson, who we will introduce in a little bit more detail later. But good afternoon, Leo. The subject for today is all about sustainability and just discovering more about the sustainability piece. And some of you very kindly put some questions through already, but for those of you who haven't had time, we have got a Q&A box at the bottom, so if you would like to put any questions through live to Leo, then we will manage those as we go through. We've already been told that there's no questions off the table on this one, so Leo, be prepared for that. You've already admitted that that's the case, so
fine.
We'll go for it. But I just thought we'll just touch on a little bit about what does sustainability mean for St James's Place. So for us as a business, we have four pillars that we look at from a sustainability perspective, and they sit under travel, health, sourcing and energy and efficiency. And these really have come in relation to the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we've tried to align those in particular to 6 of the particular goals that are there. And if anybody's not aware of these goals, if you literally search UN Sustainable Development Goals, you'll find those come up straight away. And the ones that we've aligned to at the minute is quality education, gender equality, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities and climate action. So it really is something that we as a business ourselves have taken on board. And just one final thing to underpin that, for those of you who have been very eagle-eyed on social media recently, you'll have noticed that we actually on the 8th of April published our TCFD report. Now that's probably an acronym that is quite new to some of you. So TCFD is the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures. And if anybody would like to see what that means to St James's Place and actually read that report, that's available on our external website under the shareholder section. So you're more than welcome to actually take a view on that there. But without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing Leo today. Now, having done a little bit of digging around Leo, yeah, don't worry, we didn't go too far. Don't worry. I didn't find any skeletons, don't worry. But from where we are today, the man who has the most interesting job title in the world of disruption lead, which could mean many different things to many people. So it'll be really interesting to hear what that is. But also the co-presenter of Radio 4's Future Proofing. But we kind of got there via the World Bank and creating sustainable finance as well. But there was really one interesting thing I found on your CV as well, and that's in relation to wine making.
Yes. That's true. That's true. I live in Kilburn, and I did my Achilles tendon in once playing cricket. You should never exercise, was the big lesson. And I started going for walks around the park very slowly, and I got overtaken by this really old Italian man once I only knew he was Italian, but I guessed he was Italian because he was wearing a Ferrari cap. And I said to him, because I'd seen all these trees with these things on them, which I recognized as grapes growing all around. And I said to him, just by instinct, excuse me, but do you know how to make wine? As he leveled with me in the park. And he said, he stopped, silver hair, back ramrod straight, and said, the soles of my feet are still red from making wine as a boy. And turns out he was my neighbor 2 doors down, who I didn't even know. He was 87 years old. And we started this winemaking cooperative. We got 200 neighbors, and it was called Unthinkable Drinkable Brent. It was known locally as Brent Crude because it was quite hard to digest. But anyway, yes.
So I did warn you that I would find something on your CV that was a little bit
still
random.
For sale. If you're interested in a bottle, there's still 6 bottles left.
Maybe it's something for the future on that one. But without further ado, I thought we'll dive straight into what we're here about. And as I mentioned earlier, please, if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. But the one thing that I mentioned earlier in terms of sustainability, it's actually something that means a lot of different things to different people. So just as a starting point, can you kind of give us an insight into how it's quantified and what forms it can take?
Okay, how boring do you want me to be?
Bear in mind we're at lunchtime, so, and we've only got an hour.
Okay, so look, I think there's a huge amount of BS I mean, there is no industry in the world that is magnetizing more BS than the sustainability industry at the moment. And I think that there's not just BS, there's Kool-Aid, okay? There's sort of self-deluding talk. And I think one of the most important things we can do is be really clear-eyed about what isn't sustainable and how we duping ourselves and drinking some Kool-Aid. And I think one of the biggest jugs of Kool-Aid around the sustainability space is net zero. So, you know, everything's going to be fine. We've really got the job done if what we do is we sign up to some net zero commitments. And, you know, why do I say that that's potentially dangerous and not long-term sustainable? Because you know, often those net zero commitments, they kind of are for 2050. That's someone else's responsibility, kind of shunting it through space and time somewhere else. But the other thing is, carbon ain't the whole story. We've got water, we got ecosystem collapse, we got a whole lot of Earth's tipping systems where if you talk to Johan Rockström, you know, we've got systems which just appear to be already past their limits. And just a net zero net, by the way, which often involves offsets, which often involves ways for oil and gas companies just to be maintaining their existing business model by buying those offsets. It doesn't address those much bigger concerns around the E. Okay, and then the other problem we've got is the E. It just ain't the whole story at all. We've got, you know, existing levels of inequality which look like they're on a trajectory to amplify and worsen. There's an E, S, and G dynamic, and the G, you know, if we know around carbon at least, we want science-based targets, and it's kind of meaningless without science-based targets and verification and disclosure, the type of TCFD stuff you're talking about. We haven't even got the hope of a target around S. We don't even know what a target might look like for G and real changes in power structures where you're starting to empower people. So if you want to talk sustainability in any type of honest way, it's got to be kind of putting away the jug of Kool-Aid and thinking, you know, what are the challenges of the ecosphere, the people dynamic, the S, as well as the E, and what is something quite fundamental that could help us reorientate our economic model to live within it.
So one of the things you touched on there, we've had a question come through that kind of relates to that as well. So obviously the E piece in the ESG, the term greenwashing is something that we hear quite a lot about as well. And what's your views on that in terms of that specific part of this? Do you think it's something that's quite commonplace?
I think it's completely endemic. Absolutely. It absolutely is. And you know what's really interesting is how you're starting to see the pressure mount up to do something that's deeper. And you're seeing a whole load of satellite-based imaging that is completely, you know, blowing the lid off companies' own accounts of just how sustainable their supply chains are. You look at the reality of the data, this stuff is getting deforested. So you're seeing a really interesting trend towards much greater real-time analysis and monitoring that I think is making the greenwash harder to carry out as a sort of modus operandi. And then the other thing that's happening around, it's not exactly the death of greenwash, but it's greenwash is having to up its game, is people are realizing that this stuff, it ain't just sort of gesture politics. It ain't just tokenism. And I'm thinking of stuff like, actually, you know, related to TCFD. If you've got central bank regulators who are saying, as Mark Carney did, you know, this is the biggest systemic risk to the economy. And therefore, one level down, this is materially affecting the risk level of banks within the system, whether or not they've got whether they've got portfolios that are really highly exposed to stranded assets and carbon liabilities that they haven't factored in at all, then suddenly it's in the bank's interests to de-risk their portfolios, because otherwise their cost of capital is higher, which means that a company like Rabobank can look at a company like Britvic, who it's lending to, and say, okay, you have made science-based targets, and in your agribusiness, you are doing some regenerative agriculture practices, which we think are actually lower risk, and going to reduce our risk of a stranded asset in our portfolio. And we're going to then reflect that with a lower cost of capital. And if they're going to do that, there's only one condition that they're going to do it on, which is that there is proper monitoring, reporting, verification, that there ain't no greenwash in it. So the system, I think there's this externality out there, which is all all these completely unfactored in, unpriced social and environmental costs. And slowly, it's almost like the externality is the endangered species. People are coming in with their bows, with their arrows, and they're just shooting at that externality, making it harder and harder to BS the system. But there's still a huge amount out there.
But there's a question just come through live with a term that I have to say is a bit new to me. So I'm hoping that you may recognise this one. It says, do you have a view on greenwashing?
What is greenwashing?
That's another one for me.
How do you spell greenwashing? What is it?
Greenwashing, Hushing. So yes, it was an interesting question that's come through. They've just shared it.
Greenwashing.
Greenwashing, yes.
Okay, I'm slightly sort of going jazz here and improvising.
That's fine. Me too.
I want to take that to the space of hushing and silencing a motive and a mandate within the organization for a company to do more. Mm-hmm. That I think what we've all probably found is in our organizations, there's this really surprising new force emerging. And I was with a bank in Asia the other day, high carbon footprint Germany, and they were saying like one of the big levers we see is actually for change is within the workforce. There are just people who say we do not want the job that doesn't have some meaning, and the tradition I think has been for us to kind of silence ourselves if we felt that, to hush, to make the link back to the question ourselves, and just to expect to live in this sort of slight space of dissonance where there's this gap between our own values, social, green, whatever it might be, and what the organization can deliver. And we kind of silence ourselves and we suppress it and we live in that dissonance. And what I think is really interesting is the emergence of new voices. And you see this with the Greta Thunbergs, of course, but you see it in these organizations where across the board, public and private sector, these employees are basically standing up and saying, we know you need the best people. We know the thing you really care about, especially at this moment of the sort of the great resignation, is recruiting and retaining really good people. And we are not going to be silenced. This is what we care about. This is our agenda. You, if you want to keep us and motivate us, have got to deliver on this program. And I don't know whether that is at all what this question was referring to, but I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, which is the emergence of these new voices. And it's almost a new form of leadership, not from the top, but from any level in the organization. People are just saying, I want to expand the value set of the organization rather than shrink my own to fit it.
So the person who asked the question has actually sent through a link. So I'll share that with you afterwards, Leo, so you can get a little bit more information.
As long as they haven't said that was nothing to do with the question that I asked.
We'll save the feedback for later. It's fine, don't worry. There's a question that came through that related to something that you touched on earlier, and that's in relation to the investment decisions. And what impact do you think this is having on those investment decisions being made by businesses?
Dan, hold on. Can I just admit, I just finally discovered the technology that I've actually got the right answers to these questions and in the link. Can I just hold on? Let me just say with it. And I was just reading that. Thank you, Nick and Olga, for being much more on the ball than me. So I completely invented what I hoped was an interesting take on this. But yeah, greenwashing is where you just quietly go below the radar and prove it and do it. Yeah. And build credibility and trust and relationships. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you're still at this moment where there's huge value to be created for the organization in actually showing results. So I think make sure that you communicate those results to the people who know it, but absolutely eliminate the brag, eliminate the spin. Thank you, Olga and Nick.
So, do we think that businesses are very good at communicating these things?
Broadly?
Yeah.
No, because I don't think historically there's been a good story to tell at all. And I think you have to probably distinguish between categories of business. And what's really fascinating, and sort of with my PwC hat on, I work a lot with climate tech startups and social enterprises. And what you're really seeing is this emergence of a new set of businesses which are sort of paradigm busting, which are often taking new tech, fourth industrial revolution technologies, and they're just coming up with ways of doing stuff where the solutions are 10x better. And they're just ripping carbon out or delivering solutions that you just couldn't have thought of as possible before. Now, of course, what you've then got is a set of organizations who've got enormous power to communicate, generally with a bad story, who've been the existing incumbents, then a set of startups with no platform, with these hugely promising technologies and none of the huge voice out there in the marketplace, none of the giant PR departments, none of the budgets. And I think we're at this really interesting moment where, and I bet you there's people on this call who've got a startup. And what you really want is, of course, it's access to capital. But capital's in abundance at the moment if you've got a good idea. It's really, as well as the sort of regulatory framework, it's access to the product market fit. It's access to those big platforms, those big companies who you can prototype with, get down the learning curve with, really start to scale up your product into the market. And I think once you get that fit, then I think you're going to be able to join forces with the platform of the larger group that's got the comms capability as well, and really, really get the communications out there.
So just for kind of focusing on those businesses there, what I'm hearing is that actually for the newer startup businesses, so this is almost slightly easier. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a series of startups who are just busting old business models. If you read the Rethink X reports, they're really great. And if ever you're feeling really depressed, by the way, it's worth reading. And I don't know, my own mood goes up and down on this stuff. I don't know about you. There's moments where you think, we are doomed. We are literally. And there's moments where you think, oh my God, the technological arsenal we've got is so powerful. It's so powerful. But the Rethink X report is essentially saying, if you look, it's kind of focused a bit heavily on the carbon side. But if you look at the rump sectors, which are really accountable for 70 to 90% of the carbon, and this is in the food business and in the transport business and the energy business, you've got combinations of revolutions in those startups around autonomous electric vehicles, around renewable energy, which of course feeds in with the vehicle to grid integration, and then around agriculture with synthetic biology and precision fermentation, where these just pull the carpet out from the existing high emissions model. And they all depend not just on one technological innovator, but on kind of ecosystems, clusters, technological systems converging. But what's fascinating is, right at this moment where it feels like we are headed on the wrong path, the car is headed towards a cliff. These clusters are starting to form and to knit together. And when they do transform, if you look historically, they transform at great pace. The S curve, when it takes off, it properly takes off. Whether we're in time on that window, given the Earth Sciences challenge, is a wholly other question. But the startups, they've got the story.
So I'm not sure I'd want to be on that car just now if it's heading towards that cliff, but
I think you are, Diane. You're in
well,
that
yes, not through choice. um, but I think there's quite an interesting question come through, and I think this is probably something that around lots of dinner tables has been discussed. It's like, how would you go about discussing and promoting sustainability to friends and family? You know, a general conversation, because I think it's so different, the meaning to many people. So can you give us an idea as to how you think that would work?
So I'm always torn with this one on the gloom side and the upside and the downside story.
We can go for both.
I mean, and I think my experience is the downside story just doesn't work. That no one wants to hear it. We all know it. We all suspect it. You know, is there anyone on this call who doesn't have a sort of a faint dissonance in the back of their mind that we got some major challenges in the current model? I think you've got to ask yourself what you're trying to achieve in those conversations with your family, friends, loved ones. And if you want to depress them, I think it's pretty easy to depress them. But you're not going to achieve anything apart from that. If you want to get them to do something, then, you know, surface level, you know, I think get them excited about some startups. Talk to them about some of the startups that are doing something. Get them to invest micro equity in some of the startups. Get them to go on some of the crowdfunding platforms. You know, get them some skin in the game. Help them even, you know, set something up, because the barriers to entry on this stuff are so low at the moment. I see we've got a question from Neil. Neil, okay. And then why don't we? Well, let me just make one point, the last point before we, and then I'd love to go. But I think the biggest one though is, you know, that great line from Kentaro Toyama, who's the former Microsoft research director. He says, "Technology is not the answer. It's not about tech. It's the amplifier of intent." You know, the real question is, how do we manage to locate in ourselves or help someone else in themselves find that intent? You know, that's the question.
Yeah, and I think probably the thing that jumps to mind for me then is to probably say to you, as you know, you personally, where did this start for you? Where did it become a passion?
And you know what? I've often asked myself that question, and I was asked it the other day as well, and I just completely stumbled, and I'm still stumbling. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there's something to do with, I like making stuff. I love making stuff. And I also I love other people, you know, other people flourishing and being part of their community. It just feels like, you know, you want the river to flow without the logs blocking it. You know, you want people to be doing stuff where they are thriving and they're flourishing. It just seems bonkers not to have that as a vision. And if I've got one answer to your question, it's actually that, you know, I think it's the social agenda that got me going before the environmental. And I love the environmental agenda because I think we just all need to be healed and to reacquaint ourselves with, you know, walks in forests. We all need that, and all the medical data shows that the affective disorder when we're sitting in these concrete blocks, it really gets us. But the thing that I think really most motivated me was just the social stuff of seeing the talent, the creative capabilities of people who are coming from backgrounds where they hadn't been given much, and where they had all this talent, all this, you know, what Clay Shirky calls cognitive surplus, all this ability to contribute brilliant ideas, and not just brilliant ideas, but their own brilliant ideas that really resonated with the problems they faced. And it just seems to me, if what we've got is this moment where we've got an arsenal of technology that's out there to solve the world's problems, and this huge mass of underutilized talent who right now are facing giant challenges. You know, there's going to be 4.9 billion people in Asian African megacities, 1.5 billion climate distressed refugees, according to the World Bank, where I used to work, as you know, by 2040. It's this moment where we need to step in and line up the arrows and equip that incredibly talented group of people with the technology, the intent to deploy it to help solve those problems. And it's both wanting to share in that joy, but also in that vision of helping to unlock that talent towards the problems. And I can't express it better than that. And that was rubbish. But that's as good as I got.
Not at all. And I think it's really interesting to hear a slightly different take on it sometimes, because we do hear so much focus on the E part of this. So to actually hear a different perspective on that, it is really, really interesting. And one of the questions that's come through, which I actually thought was quite an interesting one, and be interesting to hear your take on it. In which area do you think businesses need to focus on more?
Of the E and the S and the G?
Yeah.
Ooh, I think it's the S.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that, well, okay. Carbon, all right. Have we solved carbon? No. We know we need to decarbonize now at 12.9% a year, 5 times more than we've been doing. We're not even close. But the machinery is starting to form. The regulatory and civil society and business vortex is getting tighter enough to make me think. And even like with COP, the ratchet mechanism, it's not good enough, but it's getting tighter. So I think with carbon, you can imagine the possibility that we will get there. You can imagine that exactly the same framework could be used for water, for natural capital, as we're starting to see, et cetera, et cetera. So you can imagine conceptually that we could get there.
Mm-hmm.
That's the E. On the S, just like in the beginning of this conversation, we've got a global value chain model that is based around labor and environmental arbitrage. It's based around trying to find the cheapest sources of these factors of production. That's just what it's been doing. And it, of course, is concentrating wealth. It's, of course, raising productivity, raising living standards, but it's raising inequality. And then confronted with the climate stresses, they are rolling back the living standards. We've got David Malpass of the World Bank saying we're facing a food humanitarian catastrophe in terms of food prices. This is the reality that we're in. And the combination of the climate crisis and the supply chain crisis and the ongoing COVID challenges in Shanghai and Beijing means that we're going to be seeing structural causes of inflation and potential interest rate rises as well, which means that the capacity of governments to meet those debt service coverage payments and then manage to step in for those people facing food price challenges, energy price challenges, debt challenges is going to be really, really limited. So we're facing a social crisis that OECD and emerging markets that is barreling down the track. Meanwhile, we're locked in a model of consumer capitalism that basically is still tied to the assumption that the answer is more of the same, more growth, and everything's going to be fine. So we got an absolutely fundamental challenge around the execution and the business model in terms of what we're doing on S. And there's no amount of stuff, just like with the E, there's the Kool-Aid of net zero. On S, there's all sorts of stuff that, just like net zero, is absolutely crucial. It's necessary, but insufficient. On the S, we've got a whole welter of things which are necessary, but not sufficient. And if we tell ourselves that just the gender composition of our panel, so we've dealt with the global S problems, we haven't. We need to do both. We need to do both.
Seems to be a common theme then, that some of these are underpinned by the way we measure economic growth as well. So that tends to drive the behaviour that's there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course, we have a GDP model that doesn't factor in any of these externalities, any of these nets.
Mm-hmm. So we've had a few questions through that kind of all fit into a common theme. So I thought it's probably an opportune time to ask that, because we touched on it a little bit in that last question. It's with all the things that are happening in the world at the minute, we've got the the inflationary piece, we've got what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. What do you think the impact of that is going to be from the sustainability perspective?
It's such a good question. Because it's another one where you can, because you already look at the quasi-Kwarteng Rees-Mogg exchange around net zero. Just in the last 24 hours, you're already seeing this possibility of net zero being the new Brexit, a new fault line where you have these camps forming. And you can also see that there's an intuitive logic. We don't want pensioners facing fuel poverty. We don't want a whole load of people suddenly, having to choose between eating and staying warm. And then the question is, what's the way out of that? Yes, if actually we had started to decarbonize 10 years ago, we wouldn't be in this mess, for sure. But this is where we are. And okay, so I'm gonna give an answer that you at SJP won't like. Okay, can I do this? So, I think long term, the dilemma, the challenge, I think only heads one way. If you just look at the cost curves, you look at the energy return on energy invested, the EROEI on fossil fuels. 120 years ago, you stuck your hand in the ground in Texas, the oil spurted out. The EROEI was 1,300 to 1. The net return, the energy return you got. After all the energy it took you to stick your finger in the ground, you got a whole load of oil out. These days, with fracking, with tar sands, with deep sea oils, the energy return, it takes such a lot, it's such a headache. It's such a pain to get this stuff out. Your energy return, your EROEI is like 5 to 1, 8 to 1 on a good day. That cost curve is just going in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, if you look at renewables, especially when you start to factor in some of the combinations of ecosystems, for example, the vehicle to grid integration, let alone battery acceleration, let alone battery acceleration driven by quantum, what you're starting to see is that cost curve is just going in completely the opposite direction. And you've now got 91% of the world's population is living in places where renewables are below cost parity with new build fossil fuels. So long term, those cost curves are already crossing. When they properly cross, they will also unblock. The IMF estimated there's $5.3 trillion a year of subsidies for fossil fuels, precisely to 5.3 trillion to keep pensioners from facing fuel poverty. The moment they really cross, they will further unlock the competitive advantage of renewables. So that's only going to go one way in the long term, actually medium to long term. The question is, what do you do in the short term? And this is the bit that I think SJP, will, and the people on this call will, I think there's going to be political pressure for wealth taxes. There'll be political pressure for redistribution to tax the richer and to hypothecate that into subsidizing some of that fuel poverty stuff. And you can see a strong political logic for that.
I'll pretend I didn't hear that second bit of the answer.
I should be really interested whether people on the call agree with that and think that's where we're going to go, and even the reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, if anybody has any views, you can also use the question section to actually put some views across, and we'll share those. That's not a problem at all. It's interesting to kind of look at some of these things, and I think there's one question that's come through at the very, very start, which I thought, it's probably the right time to ask this now, about the Piers Morgan interview with Donald Trump, where he said he's going to run for presidency at the next election. So from a global sustainability piece, we've just touched on the things that are happening around the world, and actually, what do you think the implication would be if we got back to that position again?
Of
Mr. Trump back in the White House.
Yep. I mean, it's certainly not a prospect. It's not a prospect that I think your climate, those who are passionate about climate are going to welcome. Because I think we're at this moment where we've got a supranational challenge. There's no question we got a supranational challenge, and it's one where I think we're at this window where if we don't deal with the crises that we've got in fairly short order, and I'm especially thinking of the crisis actually of the 4.9 billion people in Asian and African megacities by 2035, who will form part of that wave of distress migration. That wave of distress migration will destabilize existing political systems and will create a backlash of populism and protectionism and political systems that are unable to deliver. And within that context, I think you have a real risk of political instability. And it's political instability not just, for which you see the weak signals with Tunisia, with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh at the moment, where food prices essentially undercut the operating legitimacy of the government. I think it's also going to be for Western governments a political crisis, because COVID has moved us away from this sort of John Lockean light touch government model of liberal democracy towards something where we expect more of it's almost of the Thomas Hobbes Leviathan, where it's going to be the state that looks after us. And the problem with that deal is twofold. That Hobbesian deal is, first of all, it creates a centralization of political powers and therefore a void below it. But the second thing is, it's a deal which is based on a very clear principle, which is you deliver or you're gone. We're going to give you these powers. We're going to tell us what needles you can put in our arms, which funerals we can go to, etc. But you've got to make it work. And the problem is right now, the combination of challenges we got make it really, really hard to work. So the last thing I think we need in power is the worst of both worlds, which is the strongman ideology with no intent to solve those bigger problems of the world out there and solve them in a collaborative fashion. Other than that, I will say nothing.
Yeah, to be fair, we talk about the specific interview there in relation to Mr. Trump, but I think you're absolutely right. This is not just about one person. This is about a number of different people, a number of different countries. Yeah. And it's the collective influence of those people.
And it gets back, Diane, to your question about the S.
Yeah.
It gets back to our definition of the other. And what's our relationship with the other? And are we going to try to live in this country or community which will, confronted with those types of challenges and escalating instability, move towards a sort of gated community, a barrio cerrado model, like Santon in South Africa, where we have, our security guards, our private security guards, our surveillance TV cameras? Or are we going to try to open up, use our collective brains, talent to solve these problems of the many, to find these ways to make the 2 + 2 + 5, to harness this crazy, unbelievable diversity of perspectives we got? And by the way, like when we made the wine, that was exactly what we found. Like it was Paolo Sentini, my Italian neighbor, who knew how he knew the whole process. But it was when we made this completely undrinkable wine, this Iranian guy who he suddenly sort of appeared on our doorstep, my doorstep, because we were making it right in this front stoop. And he was there with his son, and he said, "Excuse me, is that wine you're making?" I smelt it. He said he smelt it and followed it from across the park. And he said, "I'm Iranian. I got expelled from Isfahan for making wine." And he was the guy with his son Ramak who knew how to put in this Iranian sugar, I think it's called Nabat, but our wine still tasted really bad. Okay? But with the Nabat, you could actually drink it. And what was the point? It was the collective and harnessing from these very unexpected sources, precisely because our doors were open, that we were able to come up with the stuff.
So just on that, before I kind of focus on some of the other questions, you say about the door being open. Do you think a lot of this really is about people's mindset change and about opening their mind to it?
Completely. And I don't know about you, but I think we get lost in the day job. We get lost in the stresses and the grief. Some of it's self-appointed, and we get addicted to money, and we get addicted to these ego structures that are about our power and our status, and which leave us, of course, in this strange place where we know it's not really working for us, where we know that another 2% on our bonus is not the thing that's going to transform our lives. And we know that it leaves us in some way mourning some connections with our family, with our loved ones, with our friends, with the people and places that actually compose us as real human beings. But we're locked in it. We're absolutely locked in it. So I think the ultimate, the principle that, first of all, it's not about you, but then actually it is about you. It's about you figuring out how you can manage to locate something inside you that can step out and say, okay, I'm actually slightly different to that person. I know that person who's doing that job and they're doing a great job, but I got something else inside me that wants to get out and wants to be a contributor, to participate in shaping something different. I think it's about finding that other bit.
So from a kind of business perspective, are there any companies, organisations that you think have been a real beacon for that in terms of putting themselves out there and saying, we want to be different, we want to do this differently? Maybe, somebody who you would actually put out there as a trendsetter almost.
Yeah, I mean, there are. So I think, look at what Mark Carney did from Bank of England. He broke the mold for what a central bank regulator could look like. It was absolutely unthinkable to do that. If you look at Paul Polman in Unilever, of course, with some disgruntlement from the shareholders. If you look at Jochen Zeitz with Adidas doing the first ever profit and loss account, up and down, I think you're starting to see that there is this potential to think of three different categories of leaders for me. There's sort of bad leaders, and they're not the problem, because bad leaders get sacked. It may take too longer, but they get sacked, so no problem. No. Then I think there's good leaders, trained professionals, efficient, and then there's transformational leaders. And for me, actually, the real problem is the good leader. It's the leader at this moment when we are in this car that's headed over, you could argue, at accelerating speed towards the cliff. What the good leader's trained to do, and for all of us who on this call have been to business school, that's what we're taught. We're told get in and basically pretty much sustain the direction of travel. Maybe get a better fuel use, roll down the windows, get better air ventilation, pump up the tires properly, but essentially manage the ship and do a really highly professional job as we go over the cliff. And it's not to get behind the wheel of the car and really change the direction. So I think that if I was to find a real hero, it's actually outside of sustainability, and it'll be in racing, which may sound paradoxical, but it would be this 5'2" former ambulance driver from Italy called Tazio Nuvolari, who Ferdinand Porsche said was the fastest driver of the past, present, or the future. And he was in World War I getting shelled in the trenches, and that's where his ambulance was. And he just said, this isn't working. He was doing these through the mud of the trenches, getting shelled. This just wasn't working. He was like a sitting duck. And he just came up with this tactic, which he called drifting the curve, where when you want to turn a corner, you don't brake, you accelerate. You accelerate, you slam the curve, and then you just drift it and you bisect it. And you kind of travel on the Z-axis. And I think the leaders that we've got today are in this moment where it's not working for the broader world, the direction of travel of sort of fossil fuel-based mass production and the global value chain, for all those environmental, social, and economic challenges we've been through. It's not working amazingly for them. They know there's something different they want to be doing with their lives. They know they want to connect with the purpose mindset. But the extraordinary thing is it's not even in the medium term working for their organizations, because there are these opportunities to bust the groove, to drift the curve and start to do something. So, the most exciting thing that's happening now is to see these C-suite leaders of the big organizations looking in the mirror and then looking outside the mirror at this universe of startups and thinking, okay, what's our relationship with them? Can we incubate them? Can we partner with them? Can we acquire them? Can we become them ourselves? Can we really start to transform our businesses? And look at what Baker Hughes is doing in that space as another example of really like, yes, we are going to transform our businesses. Yeah, that's the moment we're at. And I'm really excited about this. It feels like almost like the concrete is starting to break with this generation of CEOs who think maybe there is a different model of growth that we can put our companies on a trajectory towards.
So it actually feels like there's almost a shift change there, because it used to be the smaller companies looking towards the bigger ones, but actually from this perspective, it's very much the opposite.
Totally. The startups are the cool kids, absolutely. And they got all the toys, they got all the shiny toys, absolutely.
So I'm sure on the call, we've got quite a few people who are, just in the phase of building those startups. If you could give them one piece of advice, what would that be?
So I think the excitement factor, like, is it literally, does it really solve a problem? Does it really solve a problem that you care about? Because that's what's in the end going to excite you more than just the cash. And that, paradoxically, is what's going to get the crowd to collaborate with you. I think once you get, it's this difference in sort of mandate versus mission. Once you're solving a problem that really matters, you'll find that you as a startup will be able to attract this amazing ecosystem of collaborators. And it'll be high net worth philanthropists, it'll be other people on this call who will want to chip in. It'll be the big businesses. Of course, there'll be the media spin. You'll get the volunteers, the best and the brightest, who can really build you your wireframe and then actually prototype it. And then you'll get who knows what, GCP to give you free cloud precisely because it's cool. So if you build the stuff that's got the purpose baked into it, that I think takes you a long, long way. Then I think the second thing is find the right anchor partners for the product market fit, but don't let them buy you. Don't let them buy you, okay? Keep on, structure some really Loctite IP relationships where you get the best of both worlds. You get the scale, but you keep the capital table clear.
I can see lots of people now writing post-it notes that says, Leo says, don't let them buy me.
until the moment comes, until the right moment comes.
So just a final shout out. We've got 10 minutes left. So if anybody has got any final questions, please do actually put them on the chat box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So we'll just cover off a couple of these, Leo, if you don't mind. So it says, to what extent do you believe that responses to COVID in terms of clean air, lower occupancy, etc., have negatively impacted the sustainability agenda?
Ooh, another good question. I think, look, obviously it's opened up this whole remote working thing with, this shifting at least of the carbon burden into our own households where we don't measure it. So it's giving the illusion of a great progress, which is a bit of a debate. But the other positive, I would say, strangely, is that whole thing that big businesses say, which is we need people to come into the office because we need to maintain the culture. Like, wrong. Like, the last thing you want these big businesses to do is maintain the culture. You need the new culture to emerge. You need the WeWork culture. You need these people mixing and matching and coming up with their own visions and their own problem set. So I really like the fragmentation of the culture that and the opening up of new cultures that COVID created, as well as the opportunities for a whole lot of people who it was really difficult to come into the office for. So there's been some positives, but big picture, I think it's going to pose some real headaches. So the theory with COVID, of course, was that comorbidities was the problem. People who were already sick got the sickest, and I think we as an economic model had some existing comorbidities of the environmental burden that we've been through, of the social burden of inequality and the economic burden of debt. And what COVID has done is it's made each of those worse. On the debt side, we have got now peak levels of historically of household, corporate, and national debt. And there is just not the stockpile of QE available to deal with the next crisis. On the inequality side, this will rain down into debt service coverage payments, the people with the greatest debt at the individual level. And of course, for SMEs, 21% of UK SMEs are zombie economies, where just a 1% increase in interest rates makes them unserviceable. But above all, in the emerging markets, where you've got 18 countries which are already struggling to meet their sovereign obligations. In other words, 18 Argentinas simultaneously, and that's on current interest rate levels. So you've got COVID amplifying a giant economic problem. And then, of course, that has a ripple effect, as we've already talked about with net zero, into the carbon budget, where what you're starting to see is a lot of people saying, okay, settle down, steady on, let's open back up that fracking operation that we just concreted over. Let's think about, so COVID, I'm afraid, has potentially amplified all of those three problems.
And for somebody who's actually worked from home for a long period of time, it actually was quite nice to see other people experiencing that side of it as well. So,
yeah.
It has been quite different for many people. So I think, the implications.
And it sort of made everyone, it put everyone on the same level. We were all in this Zoom box of punishment where we...
Yes. Yes. Well, for somebody who probably 2.5 years ago didn't know what Zoom was, I will openly admit that. So yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm not on my own on that one. Another specific one that's come in relation to what's happening at the minute. So with necessary deadlines fast approaching, so that the 45% carbon reduction by 2030 and the net zero that you touched on earlier, how optimistic are you that we will reach those targets?
I'm trying to answer this. I have a hunch that what we will turn to will be carbon negative technologies, and they will present a moral hazard, because what they will do is they'll essentially give us the get out of jail free card. We will come up with these technologies, and there's already some of them which essentially sequestering carbon from the air at about $36 a ton, which is pretty darn good. But what they give us is a giant get out of jail free card, based on as yet unproven at scale technologies. So my worry is that we're not going to do the hard yards. We're going to do the carbon equivalent of stomach pumping or whatever it is, like a staple, whatever, or actually carbon liposuction. It's basically carbon liposuction. We're going to say, I can go and I can have the op. So, I'm going to have that Greg's sausage roll, because, it's easy. That's kind of, I think, a possible scenario. What's the other alternative? It's that you have an electorate which probably would have to be some sort of cross-party consensus. So it's not politically gamed and arbitraged, which really does say, we are going to commit to this stuff, and we are going to enact a series of policies, including a carbon tax, with a compensatory wealth tax to try to subsidize this and avoid a sort of Macron gilet jaune type of political protest. And that's what we're going to do. Those are the two ways. Those are the two ways I see it happening.
And we're coming to the end now. I'm just conscious we've got probably time for 2 more questions, if that's okay with you. Oh, we've got another one just come through there, and I think actually that's probably quite a good one. Actually, what's your opinion or your gut feeling on nuclear energy? Is it the right direction, or is it a possible problem?
Yeah, look, for me, being honest with you, I see its value. And if you look at what France has achieved with it, I see its value. But I think given where we are, given the time that it is required to build, given the cost that is required to build them, given the tipping point we're at in terms of the viability of all sorts of other alternative forms, let alone the potential for them to leap out of the box with blockchain-enabled trading of solar. There's stuff like perovskite solar glass, where the efficiency is now 29%, where your house, Diane, could be its own virtual power plant, where you're spitting out energy, trading it, selling it, using it as another income stream. Given all of this potential, and also given the failure of these centralized high capex power models actually to reach the many historically around the world at low cost, for me, it's about the distributed renewable rather than the centralized renewable. That's where I put my money any day of the week.
Okay. Well, I think we've probably set the record today for the most number of acronyms that can be in one particular webinar. I know I've written. No. From both of us, I think is that the thing. So if anybody has got any that they would like us to translate, please drop us a line afterwards. We're more than happy to do that. There's a few things as well that you've mentioned you recommended. So the Rethink X was one of them. Yeah. So I think that's one thing that we can follow up with people, and we can share some bits and pieces around that. But before I let you go and before I wrap up, I think from somebody who's got such a varied CV and every different thing that you've done and all the people that you've met along the way, there's one question that's come through which I have to end with, and that's who is your biggest hero?
Oh, man, I saw that in the thing and I just realized I didn't have an answer. Okay, who's my biggest hero? Okay, on sustainability.
The most spontaneous answers are always the ones that are the most interesting. So we can do this twofold. One in sustainability and one is your hero anyway.
Oh, wow. Okay, everyone just pause. Okay, my biggest hero, and actually, I think they are my biggest hero for sustainability as well, is a dead guy with a huge beard called Martin Buber, who was this writer in the 60s. And he wrote this 89-page book called I and Thou, which really gets to me at the heart of what the sustainability journey is all about, which is our relationship with the other. And what he said is basically there's two ways of looking at the world. There's I and it, where there's you, and then there's everything else which can help you with your agenda, which is kind of like the normal business, the normal model. Then he said there's also another model, which is I and thou, where as you are with other people, as you engage with them, you are recognizing that they are also a sovereign being, that they're also kind of awesome, that they've also got something unique in them, and that your attitude towards them, your relationship with them, it's a little bit close to what Martin Luther King called agape, that awe. And for Martin Buber, he said, if you can't recognize the thou in another person and place, your own I becomes an it. You yourself lose your humanity. And I think there's a moment where we're at where we're so stressed, we're so busy, we're so scared as well with all the uncertainty, that I think our own thous are starting to shrink. Our own thous are becoming closer to its. And there's something about us finding a way to just turn down the noise of some of the stuff, say no to some of the stuff, recognize what our own authentic values are, what we know really makes those around us and us thrive, and kind of doubling down on that and digging deep in that. So my vote goes to this guy with a big beard, Martin Buber.
Leo Johnson, I don't think there's a better way to close with that one. And thank you for your awesome answers on that session. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. And hopefully we'll get the chance to cross paths again.
Lovely to talk to you. Lovely to be with everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Leo. Thanks.
Bye.